Join us for an irresistible portrait of Ann Landers starring Julie Briskman in The Lady with All the Answers, now through October 31st. Tickets at acttheater.org.
The following is an audio interview for The Lady with All the Answers, featuring sex advice columnist and The Stranger editor Dan Savage. Part 1 focuses on her legacy, from a small Yiddish newspaper to becoming one of the most powerful voices in America.
So you wanted to talk to me?
Yes, I wanted to talk to you. There's no lens on this. So, Ann Landers, you've talked about Ann Landers at length previously. Mm-hmm. And you said that the advice column started in Yiddish papers. Was this made possible by the invention of the newspaper? Was this made possible by... Why did the advice column emerge?
Well, the first advice columns were Yiddish language columnists writing in newspapers, answering questions from readers about how to adjust, assimilate, find their feet in the United States.
So specifically within that community.
Yeah, and then they started getting relationship questions, and they just started answering all these different questions. But I believe, my understanding, I read about this years ago, that the first ones were just about, were addressed to brand new immigrants fresh off the boats from Ellis Island about where to find a place to live, how to find a job, what to do, where to go, what neighborhoods to avoid, and then questions started coming in about relationships, and so Yiddish advice columnists started tackling those issues. So it makes sense that Ann Landers, in the 50s, a nice Jewish girl from Iowa, would audition. Basically, the Ann Landers column already existed. She was the second writer to write it. And she sent in letters and sample Q&A when they were auditioning for a new column, and took it over, and then became so identified with it they retired the name and gave it to her. Wow. At one point, she was a Walter Cronkite figure. She was one of the most powerful voices in American life.
Now, what did she do with that? I mean, what was her sort of ethos?
Well, she was a Democrat, and a feminist, proto, and sort of, RFK Jr., Hubert Humphrey, LBJ style liberal. And what she didn't do, she didn't abuse, but she ran in conservative papers, conservative parts of the country. She didn't abuse her role. She mostly gave advice and occasionally folded in her own opinion about politics.
But she would appear at sort of political functions and
she would support
organize.
Candidates. She did writing, she did longer form writing before she limited herself really to just doing the column.
Now, how did that work? I know today that there's, and I know technology is so different now, but today there's such a taint on you if you appear politically with someone. Then, how did she keep running in conservative papers while she was...
I think politics then were much less toxic than they are now.
Well, tell me about that.
I'm not sure I know enough about that to address it very intelligently.
Okay. So now this play is about the moment where Ann Landers is having to write to her readership about her divorce.
Where she did the truncated column.
Yeah. Yes.
She left blank space in the paper because she had nothing more to say.
She said what she had to say, and she requested that the editor not fill in the rest of the space, but leave it
unfinished, like the marriage.
Yeah. And we have that in our show too.
So what did that do for her career and for her standing for her readership?
I think it humanized her. One of the things that works about an advice column is an advice columnist isn't a priest. An advice columnist is just a person. And typically advice columnists are not credentialed. You don't have degrees in psychotherapy or psychology. I don't have any background or training, just like she had no background or training. What an advice columnist has is common sense and questions. You're qualified to give advice if someone asks you for it. Mm-hmm. You look up advice in the dictionary, it says opinion about what could or should be done, and the only qualification you need to give your opinion is that someone requested it of you. And an advice column rises or falls on the quality of the advice, and syndication then becomes a sort of referendum on the quality of the advice. So the more widely syndicated you are, the more people recognize that the advice you give is good. So the fact that she got divorced didn't prove that she didn't know what she was talking about, or didn't know anything about relationships, or that she was wrong, but that she was as human and fallible and visited by tragedy as her readers really were. And there was, I guess, fear on her part running up to that column that once she admitted this, she'd be ruined. And it didn't ruin her. It knocked her off her perfect perch and made her seem more human, more approachable.
Now, is that correlated to a moment where
Divorce culture was taking off.
Yeah. So talk to me about that, because that's sort of one of the stations of the cross in the slow march towards equality, towards...
Yeah, but also toward the idea that she began writing at a time when women were housewives and still the property of their husbands. And she herself forged a career and became very wealthy and powerful, and an independent person in the world. And her relationship with her husband suffered. He preferred a wife in the 30s, 40s mold. He preferred the wife that he married to the wife that he eventually got. And that was kind of the story of a lot of marriages in the 60s and 70s, where people married under one regimen, or one concept of marriage, which was the woman stays at home, the woman has kids, the woman doesn't have a career, and the man is the head of the household, to really a marriage of equals. And when it's a marriage of equals, either person can call it off at any time.
It sounds like she's sort of a reinforcer of these ideas.
Yes,
okay.
Particularly her old books, and her take on relationships, very traditional. But that was one of the genius things about her column and about her voice and her style, is that she adjusted to new realities, new social pressures, and adapted over time. I mean, she was sort of a mirror held up to the culture in a way, not just the column itself, not just the letters, but also her personal growth as she worked on it, as she wrote it, as her ideas about the way things ought to be met up with the reality of the way things actually were, based on the mail pouring into her office from people. It's very easy to say, everybody should stay at home, raise their kids, stay married for life, blah, 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 until you start opening the letters, until you start reading the mail from people who are in situations where it's not about what's best, but about what's least worst. And early on, she advised, one of her taglines was, "Are you better off with him or without him?" Which she started saying to women who were in unhappy marriages. They should ask themselves, are you better off with him or without him? And if the idea being that if it was without, you should leave. And so here you have this advice columnist in the 50s and 60s telling women to get divorced from men who were pieces of shit. It was easy to say, you should work on your marriage, right? And affirm the then prevailing cultural...
Satisfy your husband,
ideal that marriage was for life.
If it's not working, cook better dinners,
Right.
And which we still hear from the religious right. We still hear that sort of, women should make themselves attractive. We hear that from Pat Robertson and other people like that, right?
Lest they become lesbians.
Lest they become lesbians.
Because it's about neglecting personal hygiene. It's just a slippery slope from there down to lesbianism.
So it sounds like...
Join us for an evening of home truths and delicious dish with renowned advice columnist Ann Landers in The Lady with All the Answers, now through October 31st at ACT Theater. Starring Seattle great Julie Briskman as Ann Landers, The Lady with All the Answers is an irresistible portrait of the woman who used charm, chutzpah, and one hell of a Rolodex to become America's therapist. Now through October 31st. Tickets at acttheater.org.